Today on Austin Faith Dialogue, it's our second part of a look at Austin's religious history through pictures and stories. Stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you joined us today for the second part of an overview of Austin's religious history. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and today's guest is Reverend Bruno C. Schmidt, your pastor emeritus at First United Methodist Church. And glad to have you here again this week. We're just going to pick up right where we left off last week, which I believe was First Presbyterian Church, right?
Yes. I would like to make this correction that the Central Presbyterian Church was at 8th Street and Brazos. Now,
Okay.
I believe the slide that is here now is the one that was the second building for the First Presbyterian Church USA, as it was at first known. And I took this picture personally, and it was later on demolished, and the church was moved out to 8001 Mesa Drive. And I would like to have that shown. This picture was taken on somewhat of a foggy morning, but you get a good view of the church. If you were to stand in the same position where I stood and take that picture, you could not see the church because the trees have grown so tall. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we might say that this church had saved the beautiful stained glass windows from the old First Presbyterian Church USA down on Lavaca and 7th, and they were now incorporated on the interior decoration of that church to add some beautiful color to this church in which this congregation worships. I did get a picture of the sign in a more recent time, which gives you an idea. May we have the next slide? And this is the First Presbyterian Church. It had kept that name, where in the merger, the other church, which was known as the Old First Southern, is now known as Central Presbyterian Church. Mm-hmm. And as we continue here, there is a picture of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. About this church was built somewhere in the latter part of the preceding century, but somewhere about 1906 they merged with the church across the street, and this church was bought by the Calvary Baptist congregation. The people who were the Cumberland Presbyterians still like to be thought of as Cumberland Presbyterians, and on the other hand, it took about a year or two, and then the Baptists decided they did not want this building after all. And some of the more affluent brethren of the Cumberland Church got together and raised the money to buy the old church back, and they went over across the street once more. And a good friend of mine told me there used to be two powerful pulpits across the street from each other. Mm-hmm. And now they have moved out to North Woodrow Street. I think it's 4800. And this, of course, shows where the church is being demolished, and I was ahead of myself. But if you look at it to your immediate right on that slide, there is a picture of what used to be the downtown post office, main post office, and it is now the Claudia Taylor Johnson building of the University of Texas. And there is the church as it is coming down, and later on we find it out on Woodrow. If you will have the next slide, if you please. This was taken early in the morning when the morning sun was just catching the tower, and this is where this congregation now worships. Next slide, please. This is a slide depicting an early place of worship of the Christian church. It was then known as the Church of Christ. and composed the various groups. But they found other buildings on a block on the northwest corner of 8th and Colorado, where now the federal courthouse is located. May we have the next slide, please? This is their one of their earlier building. And then there followed another building of stone structure that we have on that particular block that was used until about 1929, when it was decided to build a new building, which we now have on the corner of 12th and Guadalupe, and is still a beautiful building and is where the Central Christian Church congregation worships even to this day. Those stones of that preceding building find their way into another church building that I will tell you about later. May we have the next slide? This is a slide of a picture of the St. David's Protestant Episcopal Church, which was taken about 1855, before the time of the Civil War. You see the people walking right on up to the front door, and the landscape is quite different from what it is now when we think of the streets that were made around it, and the way the grade was scraped on down, and erosion probably caused them to have to do even more of that. You have the building resting way up high at this time, and may we have the next slide? This is taken from an old stereopticon type picture that appears in their church history. And the bell tower there was something to remind them of a certain church over in England. And they also, here in more recent years, next slide please, they had work done on the roof. The timbers in the roof had become bad, and that has all been now supported and reinforced by steel beams that have been put into the roof. And this is a picture showing how the church sits up high from that very first one that preceded the Civil War times, and shows how things have changed. Continue. And this shows the entire complex. I happened to catch this picture about the time when everybody had gone home from church on Sunday, and we have there the Gracie Chapel, and in the next picture you will see, I'm ahead of myself, at least it included Gracie Chapel and also the Fontaine House, which was the rectory, and that was used later on for Sunday school purposes. And I don't know whether it still operates there, but the Caritas had their agency for the needy in that particular building. The one now that we have just looked at here is a drawing of the old log house capital of the old Republic of Texas Congress. And that is where, as a temporary location, some of the services for the very first Methodist church in Austin were held. And the Reverend John Haney was at that time appointed to the Austin Circuit, which included a number of churches. An older one on that particular circuit was the Haney Chapel, and which is here depicted for us. It was first located about perhaps a little less than a mile north of that particular location, but it is named after this first pastor, who is also looked upon with a certain reverence in the congregation of the First United Methodist Church of today. And here is a picture of the very first building that was ever used by the congregation of the First United Methodist Church as we have it now. There were two pastors who had served there, John Haney and Josiah Whipple, but there came disturbed times in Austin because of Indian raids, because of the invasion of General Wool into Texas after the revolution had taken place, and he had captured San Antonio, and people got nervous, and many left town. And there was the Archives War also. And so after some time, at the next annual conference, after Josiah Whipple, as preceded by John Haney, had served, Homer S. Thrall was appointed as pastor of Austin Station. No other place at all, just Austin. And when he came here, he couldn't find any of the old members. And he had to do the best he could. There was no parsonage, so for weeks he slept on the floor of an attorney who had been a Methodist, and then ate around at the various different boarding houses, and he preached as best he could in the legislative halls. And then when the newly admitted state of Texas legislature came to a close and adjourned, he began teaching school in the legislative hall so that he could earn some money and pay his board bills in town. And in this way, he continued, though, with the work in that first year. He was reappointed to Austin, and while he was there in Austin, beginning this new year, a board of 3 trustees was appointed, and they looked around and they purchased a lot on Cedar and Congress. Cedar is now 4th Street, and they found this lot, and they paid $26 for the lot. And they did not get a deed for it. They had a patent signed by the governor, and that was their evidence of having made the purchase. It was here in this church that we have, let's have that picture some more, of these. This picture shows the doctors having, let me have that slide once more. The doctors had gathered. This church here, first of all, was of a board and batten construction, and the lumber had been sawed down at Bastrop and hauled up to Austin by ox wagon. And it was purchased, built that way. And if you can examine this picture a little more closely, you see they even had a pole with an extended arm on it, on which hung a triangle to call the faithful to worship. There was a feeling, though, among the doctors that they must have an association for the doctors of Texas. And so word was put out in the publications of the time. And in January of 1853, the Texas Medical Association was organized in that little board and batten construction building. And they held several sessions there.
And
the pastor at that time, pardon?
Reverend Schmidt, hold on a moment. We need to take a break here to run some announcements, and we'll come back with more stories.
All right.
So we want you to stay with us for more stories and more pictures on Austin Faith Dialogue. We're back for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue, talking about Austin's religious history. But first, let me remind you that if you have a specific event you'd like to have promoted here during our announcements, be sure to fax it in to Austin Metropolitan Ministries 3 to 4 weeks before your event. And again, their fax number is 472-5274. We're talking with Reverend Bruno Schmidt about his knowledge of Austin's religious history, and I believe we stopped with First United Methodist Church and the doctors beginning to organize.
Yes. This group was organized in January of 1853, and if you looked at that picture, there was a man who was on horseback on the right side. He came the farthest, having gone horseback all the way from Beaumont up here to attend this meeting where about 35 doctors met. I could go on about this picture and how all they dreamed up the idea of what that church looked like, because we have no photograph of it. But this was the first place. That fall, though, that church was sold, and the property on Mulberry, which is now 10th Street, and Brazos, the lots there were bought for further building. And if you will, please, the next. This map right here shows above that number 14 in the center, the first church building. We do not have any photograph of that, and we have had to use this as an example of what the church looked like, depending upon the faithfulness of those who made the maps to the shape and size of the churches. The next, though, church, 30 years later, this one was begun under the pastorate of John W. Phillips, but this one now was done in 1883. And that church was used until 1923, when the congregation moved over to its present site on Lavaca and 12th Street. And we have here a picture of that. The way the architect conceived it, and I'm glad they changed the pattern on the roof. I would not like to have seen that monstrosity standing at the corner of 12th and Lavaca as it now is. Let's see the next picture. This right here is a view taken from the dome of the Capitol of Texas, showing the first stage, the basement stage, that was used by the congregation between 1923 and 1928, when the new building in its completion was erected, as you see it now in this. This is the interior of the auditorium, showing the pipe organ that had been brought over from the old 10th Street Church and the pews. And this is now what is commonly known by the members of the congregation as Wesley Hall. And then we have here further a picture of the church itself with the Capitol in the background. Maybe proceed to the next. Here is a slide also. I wish I'd had the completed picture of what is now the Family Life Center, the Schmidt-Jones Family Life Center of our church, which is now completed. But that was during the time of construction. And this is a picture of the first church known as Honey Chapel that was occupied by the University Methodist Church. They soon then, after this, in 1909, erected the building shown in the next picture. And this is, of course, without all the landscaping and the shrubbery and trees that are growing around it. But it shows you just a bare building as it would look after it had just been completed. But it has a long history of its relationship to the University of Texas, of which you can see the tower over there to the right side, and prominent pastors working together with the student body and faculty of the church. And now we have a picture of the first Swedish Methodist Church. Back in 1873, the Reverend Carl Charnquist was its first pastor, and it was located at that time on 15th and Red River, right across from what is now Breckenridge Hospital. And this is the central church, which was the edifice used first from 1882 on by the Northern Methodist English-speaking people here in Austin. But it did not grow because most of them were joining the Methodist Episcopal Church South congregations, and it folded. And it was on the hands of the Board of Church Extension of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And the Reverend Olander of the church that Brother Chandquist had started found out about it, and they soon were given the privilege of moving in. And that was their church until 1957, when they were out at Memorial Church. And that we have the picture of that following a little bit later on. This is a view of the Capitol, and if I might have the privilege of pointing out, over on the right-hand side of the Capitol is the old Central Church, and over to the, over the left-hand side, and over to the right in the back is the St. Martin's Lutheran Church. Maybe I have the next picture. This is the Memorial United Methodist Church out on Berkman Drive, which is a continuation of this church founded by the Reverend Carl Chandquist. Next picture. This is a view of the what we speak of as the Austin History Center. But it was at that time, that's between San Antonio and Guadalupe Streets at 9th Street. On the left-hand side is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In the center is the Gethsemane Lutheran Church, Swedish-speaking. And over on the right side, the little church there pointing to your right is the First Black Baptist. They all moved. And let me have the next picture, please. This is a picture of the First Black Baptist Church when they moved to a spot that is now part of the Breckenridge Hospital complex. But they again moved later on to Heflin Lane, as we find in the following picture. I had the privilege of seeing that in I think it was in 81, that they had an official historical marker of Texas put in front of their place. Next picture. And this is the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is rather prominent on the hill just beyond East Avenue, or IH-35, when you are coming down, say, 15th or perhaps 11th Street. And it has sometimes been referred to as Third Baptist Church, and it also has a historical marker placed there by the Travis County Historical Commission. Next picture. This is a picture of the program when the Gethsemane Lutheran Church had moved to its present location. As part of that picture, you have that little church that was in that block of those three churches I spoke of a while ago. You also see the picture of the church that was north of the Capitol, and then the one that is now on East Anderson Street. Let's have the next picture. This is the one that was built north of the Capitol. When the old state capitol had burned down, there was building material, especially among some of the limestone rock that was used for the foundation of this particular building. It was later on put under the jurisdiction and made into a national shrine, and it's under the jurisdiction now of the Texas Historical Commission. And they still try to keep a certain integrity of the sanctuary and place of worship that it was. And the next picture shows us what you see. For instance, if you've ever eaten out of the Red Lobster, you can look across the highway and see this building, of which Martin Wukash was the architect. And it is quite unusual and very lovely building used by the Gethsemane Lutheran Church. Next picture. This is a picture of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a congregation of this group of the people who had organized even prior to the Civil War, and they almost at revolutionary times, and grown into a strong denomination. And they are now on East 10th Street and have quite an influence, especially in the black community. The next picture. This is the Wesley United Methodist Church, which is a part of the United Church and the Austin District here and the Southwest Texas Conference. The original members of that were the slave members of people who belonged to the First United Methodist Church. And there's quite a story we could tell about them. They have a good, strong congregation at this time. And the Reverend Sylvester Chase is the pastor who used to be on the staff of First United Methodist Church. Next picture. This is the Emmanuel United Methodist Church, the Spanish-speaking, one of the Spanish-speaking churches here in this city. And this next picture shows an earlier stage of the work among the Spanish-speaking population here in Austin, and this church coming out of that. And then the next is the Go Valley Methodist Church, also a Spanish-speaking church. The next picture, if you please. This is a picture of an old church that has a sort of an emotional meaning for me, because my grandmother, when she came as an immigrant here to Texas, served as cook and housemaid in the postmaster's home, and she belonged to this German-speaking Methodist church here in Austin, which at that time, that was in the early 70s, a man by the name of Rudolph Brick was the pastor at the time. And this church continued to operate until 1916, when no longer it was serving a real purpose anymore. It had no debt, and so it was discontinued. But there it is. It stands on the lot just on the north part of the Federal Building on 300 East 9th Street. And then the next picture, it is...
Well, except Reverend Schmidt, you have so many more stories and so many more photographs, and we have no more time in this particular show. I hope at some point we'll have an opportunity perhaps to have you back and the rest of the collection so that we can enjoy what you have to say. Thank you. And
Yes,
thank you so much for joining us this week on Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll see you next week. So.